Welcome everybody. Good evening and or good afternoon. Welcome to a fascinating and fun area of Synagogue archives. And let me introduce everyone to Hannah Sorza-Cohn, who is from Montreal, right?
Yep.
Who is currently in Montreal, and who is a recent archivist, actually, and works at the Synagogue archive. It's Shar Shamayim, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who's made phenomenal discoveries and has lots of stories to tell. And who's here to teach us more about starting in archives. And actually, we're all looking forward to it. It's just the ins and outs of this archival work in a synagogue setting. Hannah, I turn over the table to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to thank you all so much for joining and what I hope will be a lively discussion. And thank you, Chaim, for the introduction. My name is Hannah Storzakon, and I'm the archivist, like Chaim said, at Congregation Shar HaShamayim in Montreal, which is Canada's second oldest synagogue, also the oldest Ashkenazi synagogue in Canada. I've been in my position now for nearly 2 years, and I was brought in initially to deal with what began as an archive project, which would have seen the transfer of then recently rediscovered papers to our main national repository in Canada for the Jewish Archives, which is the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives. Things completely shifted gears very quickly, and the project incredibly snowballed, and what began as a simple archival processing project turned into a full-on effort by the synagogue to establish its own on-site archive. I would say we were still in what I would term the infancy stages, as we are still attempting to get a handle of the collection as it continues to grow. We are still in the process of processing, implementing policies and standards. And again, thank you all for joining me today. If you're just trickling in. The format of this roundtable will be discussion-based, and I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion for all of us who have taken on the responsibility for a synagogue archive, or having it thrust upon them, or are thinking of taking on the responsibility of synagogue archive. And I would love to reflect on and share ideas about doing this kind of work. So please, as we get into our discussion, feel free to jump in, raise your hand with your thoughts, questions, comments, reflection as anything comes up. And I think a good place for us to start is that very question: where do you start? And from my experience, there are several points of entry. And the first one I'd love to begin with discussing is, how do you get your community to care about an archive project? And if anyone would like to jump in about ideas they've had on this, any troubles or anecdotes in terms of gaining community support and care for an archive project, I'll invite you to unmute yourself and speak. Is there anything?
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, so when I was living in Bloomington, Indiana, I was also working as a part-time volunteer basis at our synagogue library. The goal was one room, small room, and it had needed a lot of weeding down the collection, and it was a big mess. But it had a collection of boxes from past years. A lot of it was related to well, not all, but a lot of it was related to B'nai Mitzvah artifacts, invitations, or they put together many families put together like a program booklet for that bar mitzvah. There were very few photos, but a few photos. But what I started doing at that point was taking those and started organizing them one by one. At first I did just boy versus girl, and then I did it by year. Sometimes it was hard to determine the year, but that was the beginning of that. It was a fascinating project. Some of them dated back quite a number of decades too. And people asked for these things, I realized. They were asking for samples of what people had done in the past. And so it served a purpose as a reference point too. So that was very fascinating to see. So that was one project. Organizing it was a project, I'd say it took me about a year putting it together or so too. And So that was one. And then there weren't that many flyers that were being kept, and I had trouble finding like what I call like seat announcements and stuff. But that was something else I was looking for, but I didn't quite succeed in as much. I was a handful of stuff too, so but it was neat. So that was one. So the bar mitzvah was a great project too. That was I enjoyed.
Yeah, definitely. And, did you have any troubles engaging with the community or getting them interested? Are you aware if this is still, being engaged with?
So I don't know if it's still being engaged. I need to ask Joy because she took over my position. But at the time, though, I did ask those who were having, those families that are having a b'nai mitzvah, if they can give one to the synagogue, or what I did was I kept one for the synagogue. I just decided on my own without asking. I don't know if that was the right thing to do, but I just did that too. So sometimes it's better not to ask, just kind of hide it and to make that your donation to the synagogue.
Yeah,
There are ethics involved too, I guess, but I haven't. I guess not. I didn't really learn the ethics of archival work properly, I guess, too.
Yeah, and if people are curious in terms of looking and learning a bit more about ethics of practice, I know in the States this is the Society of American Archivists has guidelines on just basic ethics of practice. Same thing for the Association of Canadian Archivists. These are very short 3 to 5 page policies that can give you the guide of the very basics of ethical practice. Such things as keeping certain record groups together, which is an important part of archive work, is this idea of the respect défaut, where you keep things in context together as they're found. I can give an example from my own work. One of the big bases of our archive is the papers of the synagogue's rabbi who was with us for 70 plus years. And I was very lucky that those papers came to me with his filing system intact. And I maintain that filing system, or am maintaining it, as the basis for how I'm keeping those papers organized, because ultimately that's the context. And papers individually can tell us one thing, but when they're with the ones that they came with, they'll tell us so much more. Now, I still would like to keep on this conversation about getting your community to care. Anyways, I see, Chaim, you have your hand raised, so I'll let you speak. Ask you to unmute.
Sorry, I'm in charge. Okay. What about electronic copies? How does that work?
I see someone raise their hand. Erica, do you raise your hand?
Erica, yeah.
Yeah, hi. So I'm here from Hong Kong, and I chair the Historical Society, which means I'm also in charge of our library. So we've always sort of held ourselves up to having an archive, but we really have a bunch of papers thrown into a cabinet, almost haphazardly. So what we're trying to do is get with the community buy-in is particularly difficult here, because it's quite transitory. We have about half the community kind of stays long-term. We have only about 5 of our sort of original members going back to the 1800s, the original families.
Wow.
So getting buy-in is really difficult. And the other thing with the digital, that's really what I'm struggling with too, because I'm not an archivist, and I don't have one working for me. So what I'm struggling with is also most of our bar and bat mitzvah invitations right now. So sort of going forward, we're trying to think, what right now is history, and that's what we're going to want in an archive. It's what I wish we had, but most of our invitations now seem to be digital. So our struggle is really, do we maintain just a digital archive for all these things that are coming in digitally? Do we sort of make a hard copy? You know what I mean? The same thing with flyers too. Most of our things are only digital these days. So sort of struggle between the digital archive and actual physical archive. And do we duplicate or have 2 entirely separate things? So.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. It's something that's definitely come up in my work as well. And it's a question I've get asked a lot by the synagogue, is what do we do with the digital records? And at this point, I just haven't even tackled that beast, mostly just because the physical records are so much. People keep bringing me boxes. I told Chaim before this call started, someone just brought me a box today of birth and marriage records that they just discovered in the building. But in terms of digital records, I suppose there's different modes of thought in terms of how to treat those. Some people are, still keen for the physical copies and printing them. personally, from my perspective, I'm always a bit, like, in terms of, like, archives are always fundamentally a growing business. You always need space. And to my mind, one benefit, at least we can conceive of in terms of physical storage limitations, is with digitally born records. They, in theory, take up less of our physical space because you could have them stored on such things as like a hard drive, for instance. And files can be shared digitally. It means so much of our patrons now engage with us digitally, and even more so, that's been ramped up as a result of the pandemic. And so I would probably keep those digital, just because I'm always wary when it comes to small collections of making sure that we're using our spaces pragmatically. Yeah. Ruth?
So I'm not an archivist, but one of my volunteers has archival experience, and he's been advising us. And we've been confronting the same issue with digital files. So we had an archives committee that I was not part of, that was doing the work, and then maybe 10 to 15 years ago, the temple started going much more digital and stopped sharing that information with the archives committee, and the archives committee made no effort to acquire those papers. So there's kind of like this gap, right? And so we're wondering, like, do we go back and try and get those files or not? And our instinct was to keep them digital, and we haven't made a decision. I just wanted to share some of the reservations that were shared with me for the context of this conversation. And the reservations that were shared with me is that then you have to maintain the format, right? So that digital formats keep updating. And so if you put it on a disk, like disks that I used 10 years ago, I no longer have a computer that I can put that disk into. And there's something that I didn't know about. It's called, I think it's called like link rot or something similar to that, where like a hyperlink can go dead. And so even something that's stored online, which I thought was like, oh, that's a great option, that link can go dead too. And so I think if you do embrace the digital option, you have to make a commitment to maintaining the viability of those digital files, or else they're lost. Like, but the downside of the paper files, of course, is space, just like Hannah said. And yes, space is a premium. I totally embrace that. But the advantage is that you at least have it. If you have it in a format that you can't read, or if the link has died, then it is just truly gone. And so I'm not saying I have the answer. I just wanted to share some of the arguments that we are, or challenges that we are considering in my temple.
Yes, okay, we've got a bunch of hands. Okay, I'll start with, I'll hide my screen. So Susan, I'll ask you to speak.
Okay, hey, so I really started at the Beth Israel Library and Archive last 2021 in July. We had an archive with lots of great stuff online, and I looked on there and nothing worked. All the links were dead because they had moved the temple. What happens when you're in a temple archive, as you know, you're part of another institution. So the synagogue had everything on Box, and then everything was moved to OneDrive, whatever. What happens is you remember that you are always subject to decisions of an upper institution. And so, I mean, it's just not to not do it. Like we were talking about the link rot and watching this, but just make sure that you always have a voice and you're always up on decisions made above you and maybe completely outside of you. You may not even be considered in it. A small switch can happen and then you could just lose everything. So just keeping, in terms of keeping your data and keeping all your connections and everything. I mean, it's just, everything can be really, I mean, you may be the marketing person who's in charge of all of that, and you should make sure you're in communication with that, and a change can make a difference. So I was discovering that I've had to locate everything, and it's coming along and it's fine, but that's always something as well, just in terms of keeping it, you're part of a larger system. And so if you do have things digitally, to make sure that you are communicating with what other entities, because you're not necessarily considered the most priority. Maybe, especially now, it may be that they're really working on their Zoom classes, and the continuing education program may completely be different and not connected to you. So make sure you connect all that and make sure that they know that you have a voice. Makes sense.
I love some of these points that you both just raised right now. And about one thing is a great point, which also is one thing I know that comes up a lot with those of us dealing with archive collections is these digital issues, and then which also is related to digitization issues too. How many people have been like, oh, we should just scan everything, but this is also that same issue of like, okay, let's scan everything, but then we're still getting into the same problem of, are we putting those scans into reliable and sustainable digital formats, right? That's always an issue I have when I'm talking to the institution. And I really like the point that you raised, Susan, about having the ear of your organization, and making sure that you're being consulted on these things and they're involving you. That was one of my really early challenges in dealing with the synagogue archives, was getting people to run decisions by me before they threw out things, for instance. And also before they deleted things, so that we could, try and stop, deterioration by neglect.
Can I make one more point? Just, it was actually kind of a funny story. It worked out okay. But one of the things, we're like the oldest synagogue, the oldest Jewish congregation temple in Texas, started in 1854. And it's the only one, we're the only Jewish library really in Texas, or at least anywhere, anywhere that's really functional, Beth Israel. So I had this great big, I was going through the archive, found this great big box of audio tapes with all these oral histories from people. And I thought, this is great, needs to be where, because I had found all these dead links on our system. I said, here they are, they're audio tapes. Oh my God, does anyone have this? I'm looking for a tape player. My mom found an old tape player. I'm like, why am I going to do this? So, we didn't have a tape player. No, I was going to have to find this. And the archivist that we have part-time who comes, apparently she had it on a separate drive that she had in the back of the archive, in like on a shelf, and whatever. So it ended up being a happy ending. We found it. We had somebody in the temple who had a cord that could connect this drive. So you can find little things like that. Things are there, but they're not in the format. You may not know what the format is in. So sometimes it's just a matter of making a roadmap of things. So one of the things I've done is I've taken those drives, I put them in a box that's now with all the documents so that we know where they are, and making it. And I don't mean to go on and on, I'm just saying that sometimes the people who know things are not all in the same place. So sometimes you have to just map it, who knows what, where. So.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm seeing some hands. Eva, I see your hand is raised, if you would mind unmuting.
Sure. Thank you. One of the questions when speaking about format that comes up for me is that so much of our communication is by email. So it's not even a Word document that you could save or convert to a PDF or something. It's email. It's the weekly bulletin is now email. Announcements of the deaths in the community are all email. So, and sometimes there are links in the email, but how are people saving those emails?
It's a great question. I like I said, I personally have not started even touching the digital stuff yet, because the backload that I've been dealing with for physical records is so large because of the age of my institution. But it is a question that comes up all the time, and obviously a good place to start is putting those questions out there so that people are thinking about them. Like that's always a good place to start, is making sure that the concerns are being said and heard, so that people are learning to be concerned about it, and hoping like that will lead to finding a solution when the time is right and when the resources can be found.
I'm putting it out to this group to see if anybody has what other people might be doing with emails.
Yeah, if anyone would like to jump in on if they've dealt with this.
So I did briefly. That's because I never really deleted my emails for a while, and as I created a file. It was just pure laziness, but then I printed those out actually. So so I had, it was just a few, but that was my solution, because I figured, especially, I was afraid of losing access to some of those things, either just because of the age and just emails just are deleted automatically sometimes, or so that's how I dealt with it. It's not was I took the low tech approach
Mhm.
and then created a folder, and that was what I did. But it's because I never got rid of anything, hoarding my emails basically.
David, you've had your hand raised for a while. Could you unmute yourself?
Okay. Hi, dealing with over 175 years of archives is an
Ah.
interesting challenge.
Uh-huh.
But just to quickly point out, the National Archives has a variety of standards for digitizing things. Photographs as TIFF, it's 8 by 10 at the particular resolution. Check with the National Archives, it'll help you with all of that stuff. I'd like to go back to your original question, which was, how do you popularize your archives? People love stories. Your temple will have some kind of bulletin or newsletter. So our archivist, who was my wife at the time, a bunch of us are archivists, but started doing a monthly article on interesting things from the archives. We have a wonderful diary from the 1870s of a young boy, and it includes information on his bar mitzvah. So reproducing a few pages of that, it was very particularly, people were interested to know amongst other things, he got socks for his bar mitzvah, and that his alcoholic father was drunk at his bar mitzvah. Another issue focused on one of our prominent Confederate members. We're Norfolk, O.F. Sholem in Norfolk, Virginia. We have a number of, there was a movie that needed to blow up a roller coaster. Well, one of our members had an amusement park in the 1960s, which had been shut down, so he let them blow up his roller coaster. Look for those things. You can find all the resources you want on preserving things, temperature, humidity control, how to catalog things, how to make finding aids. There's all kinds of books and resources to help you for that. You need money. I can't help you with that. But you can try and make them accessible. Because if you can't, finding aids are the deal. But stories, they want stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, go ahead.
Hi, I'm library director for a small conservative shul in the Midwest, 2 hours east of Detroit. And we have no problem publicizing this or getting interest. I mean, people have come to me about it because people want to know that their yard sites are going to be recorded and their own history. Our shul is aging a bit, and so that isn't the problem so much. The problem for me is the mechanics of it. So I'd like to know, first of all, I'm looking all over the internet. I'm looking for standards for interviewing. To have a standard questionnaire, what people can use to, I can get volunteers to do this, to ask people in our congregation for their stories, but to have it standardized, and so if anyone has come across something that would be geared to a Jewish population. And then the second thing is where to park it all. So, online, and I've looked into several different entities. Like there's this thing called Past Perfect online, an archive space, there are these different programs. And I'd just like to know if anyone's had experience with that, how good it is, to help catalog it, to help organize it, because I'm looking to have things like online records, photos, and even records of physical objects that people can look up and ask to see at some point, but something that really organizes it all.
Yeah, these are both great questions. If there's anyone who would like to respond or with ideas, I'll invite you to mute yourself and jump in. This question about oral histories, I'm sure, is something that comes up for all of us. It's a question that's present a lot for me in my work, because we do have and we are an old congregation with an aging population, and whose stories we want to be capturing. I personally, like I said, haven't had the chance to jump into that kind of work myself, and it's something, you know, we talk about a lot. So I would also love to hear if anyone has any ideas or reflections on this topic.
So Rachel, in terms of oral history, I mean, I don't have the experience with that myself, but the Library of Congress, they've put out something on oral histories. They collected. I mean, there's the Folk Life Center that actually goes out to collect oral histories. I could find something. I know they put out a brochure. I don't know if it's online or not, but oh, there it is. Okay, yeah, the Folk Life. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, they have a lot about this, because they actually sometimes, I won't say they recruit, but they encourage people to go out and do this. So that's a great source. Sean has put the link in the chat. In terms of what they do, in terms of taking the actual recording and what they do, that I don't know. What they do, I do know that in terms of other digital questions, and when you take something that was on a 3.5-inch floppy drive or 5.25-inch floppy, you know, these questions come up a lot, and they talk about it. But the Library of Congress, believe it or not, when I say we, it's royal we, it's like they sometimes keep the old things in form, and they keep the original, and then they move into another more current standards too. But they have to keep on. They have to almost like redo everything sometimes too, and it's a question of money and time too. And it's one of the reasons I like to keep the originals as much as possible, especially things that are hard to come by in the first place, because once you have a digital, the format changes very quickly sometimes too. But I know there's literature about this, and I'll look for it in terms of what they do. Preservation deals with it quite a bit too. So I know but I know that Library of Congress actually has literature on this as well. So I'll find that.
Yeah, one of the key things you need to keep in mind, we've been doing oral history for about 40 years. You need an adequate legal release form. And there's some examples of that. And also, all of our oral histories get transcribed, and the interviewee gets to review the transcript. It's rather time consuming, but prevents legal difficulties down the road, perhaps.
Certainly. I'm glad that you did raise this point about legal issues and privacy considerations. This is one thing to consider if you're doing any kind of archival work with your synagogue, and you haven't done archives. There are legal and privacy laws that do govern access to certain things. I'm more familiar with the Canadian context about our privacy laws here, but I'm sure that there are the legislation that you can be investigating that will help guide making sure that you aren't providing access to something that you shouldn't. This might concern such things as correspondence, for instance. This also kind of ties in what we talked about earlier about how are we preserving emails. I'm sure many of your synagogue staff aren't even aware that their correspondence could eventually be subject to archiving. So a good place to start with that, again, is developing your policies and making sure that they're in line with your relevant privacy legislation. That's a good why policy development and having those things in place is helpful, because it's going to be your accountability mechanism in case of these particular legal and privacy issues.
Anna raises an important issue here. Every temple should have a records retention and disposition schedule and a retention policy, which says, board minutes go to the archives.
Yeah.
This after a year gets thrown away. What do we do with financial records? Every record should be designated. Do we retain it? Do we trash it? And where does it go? And that
Yeah.
hopefully will ensure that what's supposed to go in the archives gets to the archives. Lots of luck. Right?
Yes, that exactly.
Committee minutes, but
Yeah.
it's like pulling teeth to get a board to approve one of those schedules, by the way.
I know for where I am, that the schedule was in place from before I started, in terms of their HR files, payroll, and finances. Those have a schedule. Everything else where it concerns like emails, I'm pretty sure there's nothing in place right now, because who has a digital policy in place, right? Ruth, I saw you raised your hand.
Thank you. My first question was if someone does have that kind of schedule from their synagogue, if it's something that they could share, because I think my synagogue probably has some things, like you said, Hannah, for finance, for records and HR policies and stuff like that. But I think that's where the previous archives committee really fell apart, was that there was no schedule for what would happen with, board meeting minutes and stuff like that, and it fell through the cracks. And it's always easier to start from a draft. And so if someone else has something that exists, it'd be lovely to be able to start there and then see what thank you. Did you just put that in the chat? Is that?
Oh, no, sorry. I was just responding to a question about a how-to book and posting a link to a guide that was published a while ago by the American Jewish Archives.
Okay. So that was one thing. And then I think it was Rachel who was asking about oral histories and things like that. So we are just beginning to embark on doing, I'm sorry, I'm breaking up, and doing oral histories. And I didn't know the thing about the legal release. So I really appreciate that was raised here, because we did our first one, and I will absolutely get that person to sign something. And so this is my fantasy, and I'll just share it with all of you, that I'm still trying to sort of pitch in my synagogue, is to do a podcast like what the NPR StoryCorps thing does. And so they have on their website a list of questions. No, it is not Jewish in focus, but at least, like I said, it's always easier to start with something. And so they have a lot of questions there. And so my fantasy is to empower members of a synagogue to interview each other, to create, like a very short sort of questionnaire, and then to upload those as a podcast with access from the website. And that would be a way of mobilizing people and getting them interested in the archives, interested in the idea of oral histories. If children interview grandparents, it could be a learning opportunity. My fantasy again is to get like the religious school involved in doing this, as a project. And then they'd be on the website, and that, we would have some kind of index or table of contents. And that, again, I can see I dream big, right? That people would upload their thing into the right place. So it wouldn't be me that would have to decide, this is a World War II veteran and that's where they go, or a Holocaust survivor, that they could decide what like the salient pieces and where they would want to fit into the structure that we offer. So that's my oral history fantasy. So just sharing that with you all.
Oh my God, does that sound wonderful? So I'd love to do that in my own institution too. We talk about that a lot, about like of getting people involved. And that's one way we've discussed it, is getting them involved through like getting community involved and interested by getting them like involved in the creation of their own history, like which it can be really empowering. And if a synagogue archive is a community archive, and a community archive is like fundamentally driven by its community, so that community involvement is so important. Okay, I saw hands. Yes, go ahead.
Me? Yeah. So first of all, thank you. Those are really, really great ideas, because we're at the stage now where this is what we're talking about doing. So we've been running an oral history project for, I guess, over 20 years, but it's focused on people who have had a significant role in the contribution to the building of the community. So it's a very small subset of people. And we kind of feel like and so these are the long-term members. We feel like we're out of those people. But what we want to do now is sort of short form interviews. And I think you gave me a lot of really good ideas. So if you do put together a questionnaire, I would love to see that, because that's exactly where we are right now, is trying to figure out a questionnaire on our end. But having community members do it is incredible, because again, we're looking at how can we, a small committee, manage all this. So really, thank you for the ideas.
Yeah. Oh, and I just want to say that AJL does have a Slack channel devoted for synagogue librarians and synagogue work with this particular with a stream for conversations on archives. I'll try and get a link in there so that you can join, so that like
Yeah.
have ongoing resource sharing beyond just this conversation. Yeah, David, yes, look like you have your hand
Just a
raised.
thought. We've been doing some oral history interviews via Zoom during COVID. The idea you had about having people interacting, doing their own, you could get several community members together on Zoom, doing an oral history roundtable, if you will, do what we're doing. That might be an interesting oral history, but have them interact.
Yeah. Hold on. I see Diane, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. My synagogue just came off our 100th anniversary, and I was pretty busy supplying historical material, which was fun. If you haven't been through it, typically at these big anniversaries, you produce a book. We decided not to do it digitally. We did it on paper. That's what people wanted. But these things are usually quite formal, and what we did as a committee is we reached out to our community and asked them to send us their personal stories. And that really engaged people. And, you know, you don't have to wait for your 100th anniversary to try that. People loved it. I mean, they wrote about how they met at Yom Kippur services, they got married, and it's a very different kind of book from the 25th or the 50th, because it has so much personal stuff, and it's something I can build on with them.
Yes, great point. My synagogue also just marked a centenary this year, but centennial in our building, much older, we're 175, but it was still, most of my work in this past year was also supplying materials to complement celebrations, which is still ongoing since we're in the 100th year. Okay. Now, there is one thing I would like to share and pick up on, because David had raised this thing about sharing things in the archives and the stories as a means of getting people excited and interested. I can share that something, and I saw this, yes, money, which is, I'm sure, something that's in the back of all of our minds is financial resources. Which I'll get to in a second, but I just want to share something similar that I have done for my archive, which was the first thing I really undertook, was promoting the project at all, even before doing any real processing, because we needed to get that interest. And we have a mostly regular updated blog where I share things from the archives and research stories. One example of one that was really interesting I did over the past summer was our synagogue was host to the first memorial during an active Olympics for after the massacre during the Munich Olympics. The Montreal Olympics were the immediate Summer Olympics after. Obviously we know the history that the Olympics did not do any official memorial until very recently, but the synagogue was host to one that the Jewish community put on at the same time as the Olympics. And I found the seating chart that they had from that memorial and did a bit of research just to complement out the newspaper. And that got a lot of responses. One thing I usually find gets responses also is when we do things on members that have maybe had long affiliation, whether through multiple generations. That gets people pretty excited. So, and you know, putting people in focus. One thing that people like to see, for instance, is about our veterans, for instance, from you know, World War II, World War I, and their service. Especially, we've done some focus on those stories around, for us in Canada, Remembrance Day. And so putting that community in focus and like pulling out things that you know are in the archives that showcase the community can really get that interest. And again, it could be a possible avenue to get to soliciting some kind of financial donation too. Which we can move to discussing a bit if people are interested, is, you know, how do we deal with these big financial questions that hang over running an archive? If anyone has any thoughts or comments on that, I would like you to jump in.
No, but I think it's a great topic. I don't have any things in common, but I think that's a great topic to bring up for discussion. How to generate money.
Yeah.
Find a wealthy person who's interested. Well, I'm not kidding.
No, that's true.
We get
Yeah.
we get $20-some thousand a year interest from a fund that was set up for the archive by a family. So
Wow.
it's not enough money, but it keeps things going.
Yeah. That's really a blessing. I have to say, to be able to
I
have
mean, how you go
that
about
continued income.
doing that,
Yeah.
you know, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rachel.
I'd like to have a breakdown of what the expenses might be. I mean, there'd be, say, like I was talking about, some sort of program that helps you organize it all. Maybe paying volunteers. What other costs are involved?
So we could discuss that a bit. You know, some costs that obviously are going to come up as pay for human resources, and that could be someone part-time complemented with volunteers. It could be someone full-time. It could be through student placement. The students are, you know, for instance, there could be opportunities for practicum placements with students who are going through archive programs or library programs, students looking for volunteer work. But again, that will still need some kind of supervision. So there is going to be some financial need to compensating financially for human resources. When it comes to students, there usually is grants available for hiring students. I know where I am in Canada that we have grants that we apply to for our students. I am sure there are similar things in the States. Another thing also is the basic maintenance costs that have to do with archives. So we're talking about whatever, you know, what you have to put down for purchasing boxes, file folders. For a small archive, I don't really think it's necessary to invest in, you know, a extensive management system of, like, for instance, one that we are exploring is Atom, Access to Memory, which does support small collections, but it is a ongoing cost every single year to do the online hosting for it. I think it is all open source, but it requires quite a bit of technical support on your end to maintain it. A lot of organizing can be done pretty effectively in Excel to help save costs. If we're also talking about saving costs and, you know, thinking about things from a budgetary constraint perspective for preservation, a really great piece of advice I was given early on is that you can save some money by getting regular boxes instead of springing out for the acid-free, and then instead maybe you getting acid-free folders, so that the things touching the paper itself are still having that layer of protection. Also, there are some things we have to consider too, is that at what point do we actually have the capability to house certain things? And do we have to consider donating to another institution that might have better capabilities? Because there are the 10 agents of deterioration, you know, natural disaster, humidity, neglect, I can go on and on. These lists are available online. And you say, for instance, you've got something that's quite fragile and you are unsure you're going to be able to provide the necessary capabilities to house it. At that point, you might want to consider bringing in another institution. Like for us, our partner is always the Canadian Jewish Archives. We're in the same city as them. Some of our very old stuff has gone there well before I joined the synagogue and before they began this effort to build their own archive. So, and that's also one thing I would like to touch upon is this question of policy If you do not have your policies, I would really highly recommend forming a synagogue archives committee and forming that. And the first thing always is defining your mandate. And that's going to put boundaries around what exactly you're going to have in place. So for instance, for me, mandate is preserving, raising, describing, making accessible the papers, historical records of Congregation Sha'ar Shemaim and its members. If I have something that isn't fitting in those parameters, then I would consider donating them or giving them to another institution. So for instance, one particular example I've had is the synagogue I'm with founded and created a very popular men's club in the 60s and 70s that was frequented by all members of the Montreal Jewish community. And we just happened to have those papers because the rabbi was involved in that. And to my mind, because we're also still thinking about our own physical space storage constraints, and that there was this real component there that this might be more relevant to an institution maintaining the Montreal Jewish Community Archives, we've been in conversations to give those over to the Jewish Public Library of Montreal, which maintains more of that Montreal Jewish. So that's why I would recommend really defining that mandate, because it's going to help then shape what you do moving forward of keeping, not keeping, and it's going to help pragmatically know what all of your needs are going to be from there. Sorry, that's a bit of a spiel. I'm going to open up other people. Erica, yes.
I just have a question on that. So if you have something from your collection that's housed elsewhere, would you then just keep like a digital copy in your own like sort of digital archive then? Do you know what I mean? So that it's so that you sort of have a link, because then how to link to those items, and you sort of want those still to be preserved. And if I search my community to be able to find those.
That is a great question, which also is a big reason why the synagogue I'm at has decided to start keeping its own archive, is because they want the things there. They want to keep them. So the stuff that is already at Canadian Jewish Archives, for us, we have a good, close working relationship with the archivist there, and she'll share photocopies and scans with us as needed. So we can keep copies. I do know it's this isn't necessarily standard archive practice to keep copies because of duplication, but huge caveat, it is pretty common in Jewish community archives. I have seen it as a practice of maintaining copies of things because you're facilitating that access. I've seen that here when I did some work with Canadian Jewish Archives. So there are some things that happen in our community archives where we don't 100% do proper archive things. Like, for instance, newspapers don't tend to be kept in archives all the time, but most community archives I've seen and work with, we keep the newspapers. So our purposes here for synagogue archives, copies are perfectly fine.
Okay, yeah, so copies for us, that's extremely relevant. So our records were all destroyed during the Japanese occupation. So, but we found that there are records maintained privately by the Kadori family, which are housed in the Hong Kong Heritage Project. So again, those are our community records that are all housed somewhere else. But I can talk to the archivist and see about getting copies of that. And then in addition, we go through newspaper articles and contact old families and use Ancestry and then try to put together our records back. We're going backwards and sort of creating our own. So most of our things are copies. And then we have a question, are copies archive material or not? And that's sort of where we're stuck right now.
Yeah, that is there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say no. But it like I said, I still find that there is always caveats. Hold on, Sean, I've seen you put something in the chat here, which I think is really relevant. Depends on if risk of losing access in the future. That's great point. Also, you're not necessarily guaranteed access, so having those copies is definitely helpful. And that's one thing we are talking about also with Jewish archives. And why do we even keep Jewish archives distinct from other institutions? It's because of historical neglect of Jewish community records, and why the Jewish communities, so many across the world, have taken ownership of their own stuff and decided that we need to be the stewards of our own papers. So I do think that in our cases, that copies are valid. If
You have
yeah,
to keep in mind that the purpose of our temple archives are to provide service to our members primarily. And access to the records is critical. So
absolutely.
you have to be very careful who you deal with. Our earliest minutes went to Cincinnati. Fortunately, we got the originals back and were microfilmed. But if I had to go to Cincinnati to look at them, that'd be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I totally hear that. I said we're fortunate that the institution we gave our stuff to is a 10-minute drive from our own institution, but it would be an incredible pain to be to be so far removed from your own stuff.
Just on something that David just mentioned about microfilm. It's a good.
Yeah.
It's not a bad low-tech alternative to digitization because it still have access to it. All you need is a light source really to amplify it. But because you have the master, then you have the copy.
We have the originals still.
So, which is very good. I mean, you could always make that. I know it's low tech, but it's still some discussion about going on that too.
Oh, yeah.
High tech isn't always the best.
Right. So. And but in terms of keeping copies, let me just say something that here at work, we deal with the National Archives a lot, and then what's being kept, what's being stored in the National Archives, we have to and we have this whole retention thing and mandates, and what's considered a copy, working copy versus original, if you're taking minutes and so on. It's always questioned, but sometimes if you're on a team and you're having a copy based on and then your notes, it's something, the exact same questions that are being discussed here are discussed at the federal level as well too, and it's very, very fascinating to see that.
But on copy of that, because I did it with the Navy before I became a librarian, we mandated putting it in with the National Archives, and we had to be the forced destruction all by law. But to get it back was going to be a $50,000 fee and several weeks long. So it was an issue of having a working copy, maintaining a second. But when you're giving it to these organizations, they too need funding, and different ways to gain funding is to get the nice copy. As you go to the NARA website, and it'll tell you exactly how to order your copies of these things or microfilms if you want. And it's not for free having these access, and this is where they fund their storage places. So again, valid to have a copy local.
100%. So let's say what we can say here, we believe copies are valid. I definitely do. So I'm just gonna make sure, does anyone have anything else they want to jump in? Because we're getting now close to the end of this hour. David, go ahead.
A quick thing, you need to have an accession and deaccession policy so you don't have to take stuff you don't want, and so you can get rid of stuff you should have never had. Our archives has a parachute in it from World War II. It has two German officer cavalry swords from World War I. We don't even know where they came from, because they were just, people will give you stuff. Don't take it. Have a policy. And have a policy for getting rid of it.
That is such a great point. I can say also from my own collection, there's stuff that I've come across, especially in our museum collection. I have no documentation, no record how we got it. My favorite one, which I don't want to give up, is handwritten letters from Moses Montefiore. No connection to the synagogue whatsoever. No connection to its members. No idea how they came there, but there we go. We have them. Probably wouldn't take those as a donation now. But yes, when you're working in the community archive, and synagogues deal with this like in their libraries all the time, people just being like, oh, you want my books? I'm going to ship you 10 boxes. Here you go. I've done something wonderful. And then you're stuck with like 10 boxes of books that you didn't necessarily need to begin with. You're going to end up with that also with the archives. I can tell you today, someone just came by unsolicited and dropped off a bag at my office today. it was all like quadruples of things we already have. So yeah, having that clear thing, and also informing your fellow synagogue staff to not let people come to your desk and just give you things unsolicited. Having that kind of human barrier is so important, because I've had people, I've had someone a few months ago come up to me and say, right, take out all the sisterhood archives, I'm doing research. And I had to say, those aren't processed yet. So having those, making sure that your staff are and whoever is, you know, the first point of contact in your synagogue isn't just sending everything your way, and can act as some kind of barrier so that people aren't coming in unsolicited and aren't giving things unsolicited. Yeah, this is all one of the joys of what makes a synagogue archive a synagogue archive,
So,
is that you are dealing so closely with your community.
so we have 4
Yeah.
minutes. at
Yeah,
this
the
point.
joy is opening a box and discovering something absolutely wonderful that you didn't know anything about before.
Yeah, and I'm sure we all could have a separate discussion just on that alone, of just like remarkable things that we've come across in our institutions and that, you know, are amazing and you just want the world to see. Which is, you know, why it's, you know, we're having this discussion in the first place, is, you know, how do we get these things out there so people can use them? And we are coming up to the end of the hour. I'm just gonna to plug that in May, I will be leading a course for us from AJL, a actual proper course on introduction to synagogue archives.
So it's part of the AJL classroom.
Yeah, part of
courses,
AJL
yeah.
Classroom. So please keep your eye out for that and for registration. And again, I will, if it hasn't been posted here, I'll make sure that it's reposted on Hasafrun about information on how to join the Slack channel, so that we can continue having these conversations, resource sharing. Ultimately, a lot of us are you know, coming, I think it's clear from this, we're dealing with a lot of the same considerations, and we'll only be stronger through sharing and building a network.
We're good.
Yeah.
Then there was
3 more
one
minutes.
question. Rachel House asked a question in the chat
Okay.
about, Rachel, you want to ask your question?
Well, I'd asked it before, but you know, just like we all have online programs or computer, you know, software to do our cataloging. So similar to setup, you know, something where I can catalog the oral, you know, all the interviews, all of the artifacts, everything, and have them, and then also have them on display for people looking in. I mean, just something all in one package. Does anyone have experience with that?
I've researched that pretty extensively, and the stuff that is available, it can be quite costly to invest in it. It isn't always necessarily, you know, a one and done deal, like you buy it and then it's yours to use. There's usually maintenance costs for these kinds of things. I've been investigating one from my own institution that would likely cost us about 3,000 Canadian a year to maintain. And, you know, right now the budget is going towards my salary. So we're prioritizing the human resources, but that's something we're considering when we're talking about fundraising, is, you know, when we're establishing a baseline budget, would we be able to budget for that kind of thing? From our perspective, we also operate from a network of partners here, the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network, which we share with the Montreal Holocaust Museum, Montreal Jewish Public Library, Canadian Jewish Archives, Ottawa Jewish Archives. And together as a network, we're considering going in together on some kind of shared thing down the road. This is where an idea like of possible partnership could work for, if let's say that there's some kind of network for maybe synagogue archives in the States. Maybe Shul Cloud can offer us some services.
Or maybe a consortium. So,
Yeah, and that can help bring down costs if it ends up being like web-based, like one I raised before, Atom, it's ATOM. is a web-based server, and it might, I of course, this would have to be investigated, so please don't take me exactly at the word, about possibly forming some kind of consortium to bring down those overhead costs so that there can be multiple people buying in and supporting it to bring it down. That could be something to investigate as a potential, so that we can access that kind of collection management software, which would be so immensely helpful in maintaining collections.
There is a Detroit Jewish archive, but I wanted to be independent of that. So, you know, but I'm still just starting this process.
Yeah. All right. It is 8 o'clock now. So I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you all so much for joining. This was thank you. This was such a great conversation.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to connect, and I look forward to more conversations, more resource sharing, and seeing how we can help empower each other and our institutions so that we can make synagogue archives more sustainable.
Yay. Erica, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
The Kaduri family, was it the same one in Shanghai with the school?
Yeah, of course. It's same family. So they had split their interests between Hong Kong and Shanghai, which is why they're still here in the South Synagogue.
Yeah, my father attended the Kaduri school in Shanghai.
Oh, during which years? That
Oh, this is
refugee?
during the Holocaust. He was a refugee.
Oh, right. Yeah. So right, exactly.
And I have
Kaduri.
some artifacts from that school.
Oh, I would really be interested in seeing I would really be interested in seeing those. So the Kaduri family founded the Hong Kong Heritage Project, and not focused on Jewish history at all, focused on general Hong Kong history, and sort of their corporate history was part of that. And we got a phone call about 15 years ago. We had no archives, again, really no records. Ours were destroyed, saying, would you be interested? We found archived, but not properly cataloged boxes of Jewish records. And they're tremendous record keepers. And so if their name is on correspondence, they've kept a copy. So really our records are really their records, and they sit there. But I would love to see that. So I just, finishing working on a book that talks about the school with a kid it's a fiction, but
Really?
the children go to the school for a couple of months. So in the book. So.
Wow.
The SYJA, it was the SYJA your dad
Don't
went to?
remember. I'm trying to think. It was in Kaduri school in Shanghai.
Yeah, it's probably the SYJA. So
Probably SYJA, but I have his notebook and I have his English reader. I have.
Do you know, I was on the phone with an archivist and historian the other day, and they